If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism.
Okay, welcome back to all of you who are listening, and to Cory, who's sitting across the table from
Well,
me.
thank you. I haven't even moved.
I moved.
I stood up
You
and
stood
stretched.
up, and I went about 30 feet over there and came back. But we are sitting here at the secret compound in the Piney Woods, and it's not only welcome back to this, but welcome back to Cory, because, you know, as some of you know who are longtime listeners, he moved away from us to a distant land and is back for a couple days on vacation.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing he wanted to do while he was on vacation is come out to the secret compound and be on the show. So
Well, absolutely.
here we are, and we just had a conversation about raising children in the church and taking kids to mass, and we ended up, we had no flight plan for that conversation.
Which is how you get into trouble, and
That's
I think
right.
that's probably what happened.
I think we got into trouble because I probably, well, you didn't, because you know you're Cory the clever, and you put your foot carefully. I sort of probably stepped on a couple of landmines, but we got into the generational conflict stuff about raising kids in the church and all this. And so the one thing we could do is just retreat back from that dangerous red line of generational conflict, or we could double down on it.
And you know us, so which one are we going to
doubling down on generational conflict. So let me set up what we're going to talk about. And we literally have no flight plan. I just told Cory, like, let's talk about this. And
we've talked about this sort of stuff informally before.
Yeah, many times over the years, but I'm not sure exactly where this conversation is going to go. So here's a scenario. Let's do it this way.
Yeah.
There's Joe and Susie, and Joe and Susie are young 25, 30, 34-year-olds like you are, and maybe they've been atheists or agnostics or Protestants or
something not Catholic.
Yeah, not Catholic. And then for whatever reason, they got this bug, right? And they started listening to the Considering Catholicism podcast and other podcasts, and they watched Bishop Barron's Catholicism series, and they got super excited about Catholicism and Catholic history and the search for truth and goodness and beauty and the majesty of the 2,000-year history of the church and all this great stuff. And maybe they went on vacation to Europe and they saw the cathedrals and they went to St. Peter's Basilica, and they're like, I'm all in. I'm gonna cross the Tiber and become Catholic. And so they do. They go through OCIA or whatever, and they enter the Catholic Church, and they go, this is going to be great. And they walk into a local parish, and they find it not exactly resembling what, like, the Bishop Barron.
It's not Notre Dame.
Yeah, Catholicism videos. That's like, wait a minute. Where's that Catholic church? One of the things they find in their local parish that becomes really discouraging and sort of disorienting and kind of confusing is there seems to be all this generational conflict in it. So you have these aging baby boomers that seem to be at odds with the people that are their age. And those people are even at odds with, it seems like, where the high school students are and the kids coming out of high school. And so it seems like the average parish, over a lot of issues, liturgy, programming, doctrine, direction of the church, seems to be like not all on the same page. And then they maybe look at Catholic media and they see different bishops and priests and popes and this, and it seems like the Catholic Church is just torn up with all this generational conflict over a lot of different issues. And they're like, whoa, what's going on? And the other thing that's confusing them is they come in and they say, hey, here's this elderly priest. And I just assume like he's an elderly priest, so he must love the ancient traditions of the church.
Old guys are conservative, right?
Yeah, because he's an old guy, and he finds us that the elderly priest is like this super progressive guy. And
he was formed in the 70s, let's just say.
And then, then the young priest, you think, well, he's going to be like radical, is walking around in a cassock and a beretta and wants to do Latin Mass. So anyway, Cory, you and I have talked about this a lot over the last maybe 10 years since we started investigating Catholicism together, and we came through RCIA and entered the church, and then you worked at the parish where I'm at. We've talked a lot about this generational stuff. So this is my giant windup, which we are wont to do on this show. And after this massive long windup, the pitch arrives over the plate for you. Talk to our listeners, especially those who are your age, who are converts coming into the church, about what this generational strife that you find in your average parish or maybe in the Catholic Church at large is all about.
Yeah. I think the first place is to be grounded in history and understanding what the church is. So the church, there's always conflict in the church. Let's just get that out of the way. Like if you came into the Catholic Church thinking that everyone was just going to be singing Kumbaya, sorry. Because it's human beings, and human beings always have different perspectives. St. Peter and St. Paul fought with each other about stuff. So there's a certain extent to which it's just that's how it's always been and how it's always going to be until Christ returns and frees us completely from our sins and new heaven and new earth. But there is a particular context to the current strife within the church, especially the church in the United States. And though it's not exclusively generational in character, you will see that a lot, and it does often fall along generational lines. And so what you have is you had going into the 20th century, so like 100 years ago, approximately, you had a Catholic church that on the whole was quite conservative in its outlook. Things had been kind of trucking along since the 16th century with the Council of Trent, and then about 50, 60 years earlier in the mid-1800s with the First Vatican Council, the church was pretty confident in itself. It felt pretty conservative. It didn't really want to change or adjust or sort of be flexible too much. And there were a lot of good things about that culture of the church and about that period. Definitely not going to be all down on it. But there were also rumblings of people who felt that theology had kind of devolved into being a textbook affair in which there was no exploration, and it was just, look up the right answer and there it is in Aquinas or the 40 commentators on Aquinas and everything's good. Or many people felt that the liturgy had grown stale, or that a lot of people's experience of it was stale and they didn't understand what was going on in the Mass and that kind of thing, or that popular piety had grown stale. And of course, these are all opinions, and for all the people who thought that, there were people on the other side who didn't think that. But you started to have sort of pent-up desire for reform and renewal in the church, and a lot of that was very faithful and wanted to return to older traditions or just renew the traditions that were operative at the time. Some of it was radical and some of it was heterodox and wanted to change things about the perennial teachings of the church and change things about the practice of the church that would have altered what the church was and made it unfaithful to Christ. And so you have this whole sort of powder keg that's building up in the early 20th century, think like 1900 to into the 50s and the 60s. And culture outside the church, of course, is changing at the same time. And so then you have a council. Pope St. John the 23rd calls the Second Vatican Council to get all the world's bishops together to talk about these very questions and how should the church be operating in the modern world, and how are there legitimate reforms that can be made that won't change the church, change what it is, but help it to be more faithful to what it should be. And so the council is a huge conversation of bishops. It was actually wildly unanimous. Like you see the vote counts of the council, and these documents passed with like 95% approval votes from the world's bishops. And so in some sense it was controversial, and in other senses it wasn't. Like there's a lot of consensus. But then when it came time to actually make the reforms after the council, all of those same tensions that had been simmering before busted out into the open. And what you had was a generation that wanted a lot of change and a lot of adjustment, whether that was aesthetic or doctrinal or in terms of practice or what the Mass looked like or what the churches, the physical church spaces looked like. You had a lot of pent-up demand for that sort of boiled over after the council. So this is the 70s into the 80s, and in a lot of ways became sort of institutionalized after that. And we'll have to discuss more particulars after this, but to bring up to the present day, you have sort of that was revolution, and then you have counter-revolution. You have people who were raised in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, or even more recently than that, and who look back to how things were before those changes, some of which were actually mandated by the council, some of which were just people getting carried away with themselves, and saying, no, we appreciate the older things, the older forms, the older ways of talking about things, the older ways of doing things, the older ways that the Mass looked like, etc. And you have sort of a pendulum swing in the other direction, especially for people who are in their 30s or their 20s or their teens right now. And so you have that weird condition that Greg was talking about, where the old guys feel like flower children and the young guys feel like really sort of conservative people. I don't know what the conservative equivalent of a flower child is. Someone will have to fill me in on that. But yeah, so you have this sort of schizophrenic feeling sometimes of different visions of how the church should be. And you have people who are faithful to Christ and faithful to the deposit of the faith sort of on both sides of that. And you can't simplify it just to some people are totally this side or totally that side. But it's a clear kind of divide, or what word am I looking for? Different differences of perspective that you see in both the lay faithful and in clerics and priests and bishops in the Catholic Church right now. Is that good for historical perspective?
It's excellent. I mean, once again, you earn your nickname. Well, we haven't decided on it, but like for today, we've been, like so many people suggested, Cory the Clever. And that was very clever. But
it's necessary but not sufficient, as we talked about last time.
I'm going to be the spoiler on this deal.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because everything you said is totally accurate, 100%. But I don't buy it. And what I don't buy is that this tension that you see in parishes between the aging hippie progressive baby boomers and the more traditionalist and conservative young Catholics. I don't think it has anything to do with that, Vatican II.
Okay. Tell me more.
Right. So one of the principles, right, in scientific experiments, right, is you have a control group. So if you're going to test like a new drug, you have a placebo group, right?
Yeah.
And fortunately, we have control groups for this, because if all the baby boomer church stuff was a function of Vatican II, then you wouldn't see all of that baby boomer stuff in other denominations.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So if you go into the Lutheran churches, if you go into the the Anglican churches, you go into this, that, right? What you see is the same baby boomer, progressive, anti-establishmentarian, I would say narcissistic, I want what we want what we want kind of thing, overturning tradition, all of their urban legends about how the tradition, all of this sort of baby boomer, we are perpetually the youthful generation of change and all this kind of whatever. If it was a function of Vatican II, then the placebo groups, those other denominations, wouldn't have it.
Yeah, and that may be a function of me trying to simplify things, because I don't think it's Vatican II as such.
I know.
Yeah.
I think your historical recounting was 100% spot on. Where I quibble here is I think that the idiosyncrasies of the baby boomers are idiosyncrasies of the baby boomers irrespective of Vatican II, and that baby boomer Catholics latched on to Vatican II as a justification for their baby boomer attitudes.
Yes, no, I agree with that 100%, because if you actually read Vatican II it's not. It doesn't say paint the churches beige and put up felt banners and de-emphasize moral doctrine. Like, it doesn't say any of that.
Which is why I don't want to talk much about Vatican II here.
Yeah.
Because what I want to do is drill down on the conflict between the baby boomers and just what you said right there, and the conflict, the beige walls and the macrame banners and, the bongo masses and all that stuff. I want to contrast that with what the people from your generation are looking for or investing in. And I think that we both have heard baby boomer priests say, well, Vatican II told us we could do all this. And I don't think that's the case.
Right. No.
So let's focus. Let's do this. Here's what I want you to do. I want to hear from your perspective as a 34-year-old. So are you a millennial?
I think technically, generations are all marketing garbage, but right? I am technically a millennial.
Okay, so I want to hear your perspective as a millennial on what you think I want to say dysfunctions or whatever of the baby boomers in Catholic parishes, what you think those. Now, that being said, there's a lot of great baby boomers who contributed much and do contribute much and are very faithful. But there is this sort of thing, the baby boomer ethos and culture, that we started this episode by saying that a lot of converts come in and go, what is this? Because this sure isn't the Bishop Barron Catholicism series. So why don't you describe from your perspective what you think that whole dysfunctional baby boomer ethos is?
Yeah, I will do that real quick just to close the book on the history summary. Yeah, Vatican II didn't cause this. Vatican II is often blamed for this, and it's important to understand its place in the narrative of Catholic history of the 20th century. But yeah, we can get away from that.
Well, if for no better reason than to puncture the baby boomer explanation that Vatican II told us that we should have bongo masses.
Yeah, and how Vatican II happened, and then how it was everything that happened after it is a symptom rather than the cause.
Let's agree. Why don't you and I, at some later date, do an episode or a couple episodes on Vatican II? But let's put that to the side.
We'll put that aside.
Describe the baby boomer ethos.
So I want to be careful because you should always be careful when you criticize others. That it's not everybody, and that this is sort of a spirit or a perspective that can be exhibited to a greater or lesser degree by different people. But there's a certain perspective or opinion that is out there that is prevalent upon people who are kind of in my parents' generation, baby boomers, that saw the world that they grew up in, and the world as it had been even earlier than they had grown up, as kind of stuffy and oppressive, and it didn't let them do what they wanted to do. It kind of harshed their mellow, and they just wanted to get rid of a lot of what they perceived to be as overly rigid, overly rules-based, overly kind of stuffy, not very fun or upbeat. They wanted to transition away from that into something that felt more upbeat, more loose, more casual, less formal, and less. You'll hear sometimes people talk. This is obviously a bigger conversation too, but they'll think of the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, and what they actually mean is like 1850 or something. But that is all being, how when things were horrible and oppressive, and we just need to move into a new era where everybody's free to kind of do what they want and not be told what to do all the time. There's a certain level of problem with authority that I think is part of this. And so you put that you make that expressed in religious observance or in Catholic observance, and it looks like not wanting to emphasize hierarchy as much, not wanting to emphasize beauty, the traditional or even the more recent expressions of Catholic art as much, more modern art, less representational art, more utilitarian style buildings. This is all caught up in the time period of the sexual revolution and of a pretty drastic just loosening of morals and mores in society in general, not just related to sex. And so a de-emphasis on the moral teachings of Christ and of the church. There's probably things that I'm missing, but this kind of thing.
Well, let me toss this in, right? If I had to shrink it down to just a couple of things. Yeah. Number one, the baby boomer ethos was to de-emphasize the vertical dimension of the church, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean just the vertical dimension in terms of the earthly hierarchy, but the vertical dimension between God and man. And to emphasize the horizontal dimension of church, the community thing. So you started building churches in the round, and it's what we all, I mean, the communion thing, like it's the, right? So instead of being the Holy Eucharist, it becomes the table of sharing, and right? So it was taking Catholicism, you go back to the cathedrals. The whole point of the Gothic cathedral is to make you look up, right? To see God as transcendent. And the baby boomer ethos was to emphasize the immanence, not the transcendence. So the horizontal aspect of the church's community. That was number one. And then the second thing is they wanted that horizontal dimension of community to be reflective of the pop culture that was formative for them, which is the 60s and the 70s.
Yes.
Okay? So, this is when, the Coca-Cola ad where they all stood on a hill and sang,
to give by the world a Coke, or whatever.
Everybody, right? They wanted that whole 60s, 70s thing. They wanted the church to mirror that pop culture in not only in music and liturgy, but in ethos and in practice and in its moral positions and everything else. So it's number one, it's moving away from the transcendent vertical understanding of the church to a horizontal, immanent understanding of the church. And secondly, for that immanent community of faith, they stopped calling it the church, it became the community of faith to be reflective of the pop culture. And so if you look at the same thing, like in the German bishops and all that kind of stuff, right, in Europe, what you have is, the church ought to be reflective of the culture around us, which is why progressive Catholics all want to normalize the LGBTQ or whatever agenda and same-sex marriage, because the argument is always, well, that's what the culture around us is doing. Right. And the church should reflect the culture.
Just got to get with the times. Yeah.
Right. Now, here's the weird part. This is why the baby boomers feel like a weird anachronism, because mentally they're stuck in the 60s and the 70s, because that was what was formative for them. They were like teenagers and in college and high school and college, young people. And the thing is that for the baby boomers, they have this thing like inside. It's really weird as you get older, because like as you get older, your body gets older, but inside you go, I still feel like I'm 18 years old. Right.
You're very much in many ways the person you were formed to be when you were a late teenager in your 20s.
Right. Yeah. Which is why, my wife always, like my old man stupidness, right? Like I'm going to go out and do something physically and like hurt myself because like I could, I can't wrap my brain around the fact that I can't do the sports I used to do 40 years ago, right? Or 30 years ago. Okay. But here's the weird anachronism. The baby boomers who are in their 70s in these parishes now or some cases approaching 80, are stuck in this mental space where they still feel like they're the young, youthful, and their understanding of the pop culture is the pop culture from like 40 or 50 years ago. They haven't figured out that like that was half a century ago. I was talking to a baby boomer who's about mid-70s, and I said, you are now the same age, or when you talk about, because they were talking about the 70s and how great the 70s were and, blah, blah, blah. And I said, when that was like 50 years ago. And I said, when you talk about that, it's the same as when you were in high school or college and people talked about the 1920s. I said, you ever like, hey, back before Prohibition, they go, oh, it was always so weird. I go, but that's what you sound like now. And so part of the tension in parishes is that a lot of parish leadership, because of the priests and the staff and the people who pay the bills and everything else, are people who are stuck in this 1970s sort of culture of the church and what they think that the pop culture is. And then people who are your age, who are 40 years younger than them, walk in and they're like, hey, we're all hip and cool here. Don't you enjoy our hip, cool parish? We're so fresh and up to date. And you go, this all...
Up to what date? 1967?
Right. This like you're all reflecting stuff that's 50 years old, and it feels weird. And your generation is following following completely different cues. And what I see in your generation, right, is at least the converts who come in, you're choosing to become Catholic, because you want that transcendence. You want that, all the stuff we talk about here, the truth, the goodness, the beauty, the 2,000 years, the whole 9 yards. You want all of that. And then you come in and you encounter in these parishes this dominant culture that's set back into some kind of strange 1970s, 80s horizontal pop culture. I don't know. You take it from there.
Yeah. So again, this isn't everybody in my generation or the people younger than me, but again, it's a spirit that is dominant enough that to be noticed or prominent enough to be noticed. And I certainly feel it to some degree, but it's a spectrum. People are going to relate to this to greater or lesser degrees. Is that we've been raised in the world that the baby boomers created. And it was less hierarchical. It was based on a pop culture that was less formal and was morally more permissive and all of those things. And we're on the other side of it, and we're standing in the wreckage of it. And we're seeing that in a lot of ways that hasn't made society better. In a lot of ways, it's made society worse. And it's caused us personally problems in our families or in society at large. And there's a reaction against that baby boomer ethos. And it's the mirror image of it. And so whereas if you define the baby boomer ethos as emphasizing the horizontal, there's a counter emphasis on the transcendent or the vertical. And so that's a renewed appreciation for old style architecture, old style liturgy, the way that doctrine was taught and emphasized, and all of that. And then a renewed emphasis on countercultural Christianity versus sort of pop cultural Christianity. So being whatever the world is, we're different than that. A counter witness to the world's morality, especially, but other things too. And so you see that in a lot of younger people, and here younger, I'm just saying 40 and down, who are either rediscovering their faith or who are coming into the church at the same time. And as with this, and I'm going to transition here to commenting rather than simply describing, is that as with any division in the church, there's a tragedy to it, and there's elements of truth on both sides. Obviously, it's always tragic when there's disunity in the church because Christ called his body to be one. But also, there are elements of truth on both sides of these. The church is both vertical and horizontal. If you overemphasize the horizontal, then the church is no different than the world. If you overemphasize pop culture, the church is no different than the world. But if you just emphasize vertical, then you make it more difficult for people to approach God, and God can feel more distant. If you overestimate countercultural witness, then the church becomes unapproachable, and the church becomes, in many ways, at least perceived as judgmental and as not wanting to welcome people in. And so I don't side with the baby boomer aesthetic or ethos. I think there's a lot of problems with that. But there's also a way in which the more sort of the young trad ethos can become distorted and unhelpful as well. And I think this gets into what you wanted to talk about.
I wanted to talk about something that you and I have talked about dozens and dozens of times over the years offline. And that is the mistake that I see people in your generation making in parishes when they make the argument that the church should adopt more traditional liturgy, which we use a shorthand of smells and bells, right? More incense and bells and, the traditional liturgy. That we should do more smells and bells because that's what the young people want. And I've said to you for a long time,
and I agree,
that's a complete mistake. Not because we shouldn't have more smells and bells, but the argument that this is what the young people want, and so therefore that's what we need to do, is exactly the argument that the baby boomers made in the 70s and into the 80s. Their whole argument was, we have to have guitar masses and bongo masses and macrame banners and, what's that kind of plant, that ferny thing, like spider plants and right? And all the like macrame spider plant things up around the altar and, weirdo hippie 70s stuff. We have to do that because that's what the young people want. And if we want to reach the young people, we need to do all the Peter, Paul, and Mary folk mass stuff, because that'll pack them in. And then what I have heard for the last 7, 8, 9 years is all of these people in their 20s and 30s, some of them very insistent and loud and demanding. Like, if we don't do the smells and bells, that's what the young people want. We got to pack them in. And, if you look at parishes are doing that, they're packing in the young people. And I'm just an old enough guy to go, I've heard all of this before.
It's a double-edged sword. It can be used either way.
Because you're making the same category error that the baby boomers made. You're just going to repeat the same problem.
And we're going to raise a generation to hate smells and bells.
Well, that's it. Because every generation hates their parents' music or their parents' style or aesthetic.
Or at least since modernity, yeah.
I think since Cain and Abel. Has there ever been a generation that thought their parents' stylistic stuff was cool? Like that went, I really like the way my parents dress and their music and their this. I don't know that any generation has, because it's like, and that's why fashions, like just take clothes and stuff, always change, right? Like,
well, and that's why I think it's a function of modern marketing culture.
Necktie. Well, no, forget modern marketing. Go back and look at fashions.
But in traditional, this is a side argument, but traditional cultures, people passed down their music and the next generation adopted.
Oh, come on. Yeah. You're a historian. You know that you can go back to like medieval England, to the Renaissance, this and that. You go like fashions change, right?
Sure.
Like one generation all of a sudden decides that we need to have massive cod pieces, right? Like
for reasons,
right?
Yes.
Like you go back at those old, in the 1400s, they had like cod pieces the size of basketballs. These guys are walking around and then the next generation comes along and says, it's embarrassing. Our parents walk around with cod pieces the size of volleyballs on their pants. I'm humiliated. What we want to do is have big, long, pointy shoes. And then they had like the big, long, pointy shoes. And then, right, so every generation comes along and thinks that the previous generation's stuff is uncool. So my point is that if you make the liturgy or you make the church or whatever a slave to whatever the next generation thinks is cool, then as soon as those 28-year-olds that you think you're going to pack in get to be 48 and 58, their kids are going to hate it. I'm going to say that your kids, if you enforce the smells and bells thing, for no better reason than that's the aesthetic you prefer.
Right. My preference.
Your preferences, your kids are going to grow up and hate it because it's like that's what mom and dad's thing is. Mm-hmm. What I have always felt is that you need to make those as principled arguments.
Right.
So in other words, if you're going to argue for a certain style of church architecture, a certain style, liturgical, choices, aesthetics.
The way that you teach doctrine.
Yeah, right. All of that stuff, right? All that operational stuff. That has to be based on principled arguments. I don't want the smells and bells or whatever just because I like it. I want it because it's the right thing to do, and I have some kind of argument. Mm-hmm. And that's what's sustainable over generations.
Well, yeah, because it's a matter of tradition versus rupture. Pope Benedict talked a lot about this kind of thing. But the whole, if you're going to boil down the baby boomer ethos into just one word, it's rupture. It's breaking with the past. It's leaving that stuff behind and doing something new. And then sort of the reaction against that is, no, we're going to go back to a particular time, whether it's the 1950s or the 1850s or whatnot, and we're going to say that's the official and only way to be Catholic. Tradition is a constant and consistent handing down of what came before, and that doesn't mean nothing ever changes, but it's a continuity.
Okay.
And so if we're going to have smells and bells, which I think we should, we do it in a way that's in continuity with the past rather than just saying this is what we like and we're angry that our parents and grandparents threw it out and we just need to react against that. We want to jump back into the stream of tradition, which flows and things are just over time and do respond to the culture and how people's needs change, but don't give up what was handed on to us.
Okay. When it comes to like Catholic podcast influencers or whatever, I'm just a little like inconsequential minnow in the ocean.
Oh yeah, well,
right?
yeah, and I don't want to be
compared to the big fancy podcasters and Catholic influencers that have huge audiences and sponsorships and all that. So I don't want to sound like I'm, resentful or jealous or whatever, taking shots, but there is a sort of weird aesthetic that I pick up from some of this where it's like, hey, I'm a trad Catholic podcaster and we're all going to smoke pipes and like we're all going to smoke pipes and drink IPAs on the air, or we're all going to do the cigars and have like patches on our elbows because it's like some weird simulacrum. What's the word? Simulacrum. Right. It's some weird kind of posing of like 1950s Catholicism. And so it's a bunch of like 30-somethings that want to pose as 1950s Catholics. And they adopt the most shallow aesthetics of that. Like, hey, in the 1950s, they smoked pipes and have patches on their tweed jackets and drank bourbon. And so we're going to do that so we show that we're like 1950s Catholics.
Right. It's all just shibboleths. So
yeah,
like
shibboleth.
We're in the club.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like shibboleths and all this. And it's like, it's sort of weird. And it doesn't ever make a principled argument. Like, I think there's a right way to do Catholic architecture. I think there is a transcendent, you and I have talked about architecture a lot over the years. There is transcendent principles of Catholic church architecture. There are transcendent principles of Catholic music, transcendent principles of liturgy, transcendent principles of these things. Transcendent is maybe not exactly the right word, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That these are principled things that are sustainable because they're based on that. Not simply, as you say, shibboleths to sort of, adopt. Because by that argument, hey, back when they were building, such and such a, church in the 1400s, everyone was walking around in cod pieces. So I'm going to start walking around in cod pieces. Like, that's like really weird. Like, I don't want to see that. So the thing is that don't adopt those. And this is where I think that the young Catholics, like you said, the baby boomers, it was a thing of rupture. But I think it was a thing of conformity. What is so deeply ingrained in the baby boomers is their perception that they're radical, but their whole generation was the first generation where mass media marketing conformed them. So they're all like, hey, the Beatles came on Ed Sullivan and this and that, and the rock and roll generation, and they're all conformist to their generation.
Yeah, well, I think it's both. It's conformity to something that's.
But they created this world.
Yeah.
They created the mass marketing consumer world. If anybody did it, it was the baby boomers that created the very world of mass market, mass media consumerism. And to your point, that you guys inherited the world they built. And what I don't want to see you do in your parishes is just saying, I want to have a priest that wears a cassock and a Beretta hat, and then I'm part of a Catholic men's group where we all like smoke pipes and have tweed jackets with patches and have bourbon and talk about Aquinas. Like, I'm all for talking about
None of those
Aquinas.
Are bad things in and of themselves.
None of them. Not. I have practiced all of those things on occasion. But the point is that if all you're doing is adopting some new aesthetic, then you're committing the same error and you're simply setting yourself up for your next generation to come along and reject it. And what we have to do is get past that. This is why the intro to the show, we always talk about, the 20 centuries and 24 time zones and 2 hemispheres, the truth, the goodness and beauty, and make it about that rather than whatever cosplaying. Is that how you say it?
Yeah. Yep. Cosplay.
Right? Whether you're cosplaying like trad cath.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of what this comes down to is a mistaken understanding of the nature of the church and the church's tradition on both sides of this. Because the boomer aesthetic, again, as a caricature, as an ideal, mistakes, it sees that there is sort of some monolithic, unchanging, oppressive tradition of the church that we just got to knock down so that we can all be groovy and cool. But it's just the mirror image mistake on the trad side, the young trads, is that to say, yeah, there was a monolithic, unchanging, rigid tradition, and it was awesome, and we just have to go back to exactly how it was before. That if you actually look at the history of the church, that tradition is a living thing. It doesn't contradict itself. The church never will and never has taught something that's in contradiction to what it was, but it's a living organism that maintains the same shape and structure and teachings, but that has to always reform because it's subject to the actions of sinful men and corruption over time. And so to give the baby boomer aesthetic its due, the emphasis in the church before the 60s was very strongly vertical and very much frowned on the popular culture in a way that could feel oppressive and unwelcoming. Your solution to that isn't to make a church in the round where we're playing rock music. There are other ways of doing that. I disagree with their solution or their diagnosis of the problem, but there are ways in which we can understand how those people felt and what they were experiencing in the church, while saying we still need to stay within the tradition and we still need to move with the flow of tradition as the church is guided by the Holy Spirit, without falling into the opposite error of saying we just need to go back and do things exactly the way that they had been done.
Okay, we both have to be at another thing here in a few minutes.
And this is a big conversation.
Well, I know. And so this is like landing the fighter jet on the moving carrier deck.
Yes,
because we could keep doing this. But I want to have you try to do that by kind of wrapping up here. So if you are a younger convert coming into your parish and you see this kind of generational thing playing itself out, what's your advice? And it's interesting because you now work at a parish that in some ways has more traditionalist elements, but is more dynamic because you're by a university and all this kind of stuff. But what's your advice to that young convert who's 30 years old, more or less, or whatever, has come into the church, sees all of this generational sort of strife in the local parish about direction and liturgy and, blah, 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 blah. How do you navigate that? Why don't you land on the carrier deck and we can go to our thing that we got here in a few minutes.
I mean, one thing is don't obsess about it, because if your faith just becomes about whether the boomers are crazy or whether the trads are crazy, then that's not the faith. That's a hang up. And so try to put it in its place. Also be deep in the tradition of the church, and also I think the history of the church, to put these things in context. But I think it's being charitable and understanding to people who have different perspectives than you, but trying to seek what is essential to the tradition rather than what you happen to prefer, or just railing against what other people happen to prefer. And remembering that it's about worship of Christ, and carrying out his mission in the world. That's what tradition is for. That's what any of these things, whether it's liturgy or architecture or how we teach doctrine or how we engage with popular culture, all of those things are for faithfulness to Christ and for bringing people into his church. And so I think it's maintaining the focus. And people are going to drive you crazy in your parish. There's the side conversation of to what degree do you stay, go to the closest parish to you or the parish that fits your preferences more. That's a whole other conversation. But at some point, people are going to bother you. And I think it's being charitable. It's trying to be as faithful to Christ as you can in your own life, and gently and not pushily doing what you think is best in your parish and advocating for what you think is best in your parish without being a monster about it.
Yeah, and I would just tag on that if we really are children of the angelic Dr. Thomas Aquinas as Catholics, that we learn in the spirit of the angelic Dr. Thomas Aquinas to argue from first principles. So don't just make these kinds of arguments that I have heard, which is, well, we have to do this because that's what my generation demands. Because then the other side of the table is like, well, this is what my generation demands. Learn to argue from first principles about the nature of the liturgy, about, church architecture, about, how we run parishes. Argue from those first principles.
Yeah.
It's an important discipline. Learn why we do what we do and why we should do what we do. And learn to and get good at articulating that. If someone's going to disagree with you, let them disagree with solid reasoning, not
with emotions and
this is what my side wants, and there's more of us than you.
Yep, I agree with that.
Okay, thanks, Cory. Thanks for coming back to the Secret Compound.
It's been really great.
It's great to be out here, and hopefully we'll do it again soon.
Sounds good.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back with another episode soon. But before you go, can I quickly ask you to do 5 things? First, please rate the podcast on whatever platform you listen on. That really moves it up in search rankings. Second, please write a review on either Apple Podcasts or on our website, consideringcatholicism.com. That encourages others who are searching for a Catholic podcast to try this one out. Third, please share it with others. Send them a link or post an episode on your social media. Fourth, please write me at consideringcatholicism.com or leave a comment on our website. I'd love to hear your comments, your questions, and your stories. And finally, this podcast is 100% donor supported. My donors keep me going, they help cover my costs, and they let me dedicate more time to researching, writing, recording, and editing to get the episodes out to you faster. So please consider giving a one-time or recurring donation through the links in the show notes or on the website so that this ministry can continue and grow. And never forget, Christus vincit, Christus regnat, and Christus imperat.